here today with David Tuckett, who's a professor of psychoanalysis at the University College London. And David is also one of our inaugural grantees of the INET Grantee Program for a fascinating project called A Proposal to Develop Emotional Finance. David, I have to say, I'm enough of an economist that if I just saw this title, I would say, no. How can that be, emotional finance? But I've read this proposal now, and I see why it was funded. What you're trying to do, if I got this right, is to say, well, people are facing this nighting uncertainty that everyone's talking about, this kind of uncertainty that economists find it difficult to model. But let's actually look at how people behave in those situations from a psychoanalytic point of view. It's fascinating. You're a psychoanalyst by training?
That's right, yes. I mean, my background training is also in sociology, and so I try to use standard sociological techniques of interviewing, qualitative interviewing, but with systematic ways of analysing the data, in order to try to understand something about the context in which people make decisions. Because my argument would be that context very much limits your possibilities, and in particular, when it comes to the real situations that the people I interviewed faced, they couldn't know what was going to happen next, but they're required to make decisions which make them have to make assumptions about that. And that does take them, as you say, into the area of uncertainty.
Well, it sounds sort of like life, but these people that you're interviewing are fund managers, so they have a very specific set of decisions. They're trying to choose a portfolio or buy or sell.
Exactly. And I mean, basically, the uncertainty affects them in a series of ways. In particular, they are subject to massive amounts of information. And with modern computers and so on, they've got tons of things coming through on their desk. They've got people calling to tell them what to buy. They've got all sorts of things happening. So the basic situation they face is one of not just uncertainty, but information ambiguity. The whole question is which bits of information to pay attention to and which bits not. And the nature of financial assets, which I think economists haven't sufficiently attended to the difference between a financial asset and, for example, buying a television or a car or something. Because with a financial asset, the first point is that it's going up and down is the nature of it. And when it goes up, you feel excitement about the possible gains. When it goes down, you feel great anxiety about loss. So you cannot do this job without your emotions being engaged, although all fund managers will tell you, well, we try to keep our emotions out of it. Of course, the emotion is dominating the situation. And the second thing that's dominating the situation, which is when you buy an asset, or even when you make any kind of investment decision, even if it's a more complicated one, you enter a dependent relationship with that decision, which means it's very similar to deciding to get married to someone, in the sense that when you do that, you are dependent on the other person for lots of things, and you don't do that lightly. And so when fund managers say, which they mostly do say, you've got to be careful about falling in love with stocks, they actually know much more in a way than they fully say. In fact, you're
saying that's not just a metaphor or a way of speaking, that there is actually an emotional, that analog is actually apt.
Yeah, you basically have to fall in love, or you have to do something similar to that to make the decision. You know, you recall what Keynes said about that. To make the decision
You're speaking of where Keynes said that a rational man wouldn't make these decisions at all, ever.
Absolutely.
You know, if he was just calculating that the animal spirits are what causes somebody to do something.
The spontaneous urge to action he talked about. And that requires that you commit yourself. Now, what I found, or to cut a long story short, what I argue is that the human mind has been designed to make decisions under uncertainty, and that there are arguably two ways in which we think about truth in the world. One is, of course, a very important, the logical way of traditional science, But the other is what Jerome Bruner at Harvard calls the narrative mode, and where we we feel things are true because of the whole story we tell ourselves about them. And it's not that one of these modes is superior to the other, in fact. If you think about it very carefully, even science operates with a convincing story at different times and places and so on.
But that the narrative mode is particularly good for these ambiguous kinds of situations.
It's essential. Because
it's essential.
You basically close an incomplete picture in such a way as you feel the confidence to act. But it also means that they can sometimes get stories about things which leave things out. Because the whole point about narratives is they're very convincing. In fact, I would argue a bit more fundamentally that financial markets can never be more than markets in stories about fundamentals. Because what stories do, what narrative does, is it joins cognitive elements and affective, emotional elements together to make a nice meld. And markets, if you understand them as really arbitrating, what is the story about Apple shares at the moment, or what is the story about China or the US economy? Those are hugely complex.
And that story, whichever one the market is adopting at the moment, is what's in the price.
Exactly. And of course, as George Soros says, that story is self-reinforcing because then the price goes up, etc. And this helps, I think, to explain why financial markets are inevitably much more unstable than the underlying fundamentals, because fundamentals don't change that quickly. I mean, classical economics, understands all that.
But our notion of what the fundamentals mean is what's changing all the time. I see. But is there a social regulation implication of this for policy?
Well, the context in which people are taking decisions is not only what we've just spoken, but also has an institutional context. The other very, very important point, it's a very, very competitive situation, and it's a competition based on the claim that you can be exceptional. Now, of course, we know if we look at the big picture that very few fund managers can be exceptional, and yet the whole industry is based on the assumption that that is what they're going to try and provide. So this creates a very complex situation for them. Moreover, they've been given money by you and me or foundations or whatever to invest. So there's constantly a client relationship which they have to be thinking about. Now, this client relationship is what I would call inherently conflicted, both structurally conflicted but also emotionally conflicted. Because when I give you my money to invest, for example, how do I know you're a good manager? Well, I can see things going up, obviously, but the relationship between skill and outcome is anything but clear. And also, any good manager will have down periods. So when you're having a down period, is your whole strategy falling apart, or is that just a temporary blip? Now, people need stories, again, to cover that experience. There's a whole set of further elements of what I'm talking about in the relationship between managers and clients, and in how the whole market manages what are the two crucial emotions in the whole situation. Excitement about gain and terrible fear of loss. And my opinion is that the way the institutions of the market have developed over time has been created, if you like, by this underlying psychology. So
the firms themselves are also organized in a way to regulate this emotional response.
Exactly.
And they may do a better or worse job of it.
Well, both to regulate it and to exploit it, which is fair enough. None of this is necessarily critical. It's probably the only way it might be done. But the firms obviously sell to you the idea that they can do better than the average. And then, of course, the people have to try and do better than the average. And the risk all the time is that they come to believe of themselves as what I call fantastic objects, which is an unreal state of feeling you're absolutely fabulous. And so the whole market potentially is constantly looking for fantastic investment opportunities conducted by fantastic managers, which, as we know, is unlikely to happen very often. And so this is why whenever there are new products in the market or new innovations, the dot-com bubble was a good example, people get terrifically excited, and almost inevitably there's an overrun in the whole situation. Because
now, where does this come from in your life? You mentioned that you had studied sociology before, and you're a trained psychoanalyst also, and I guess you must have gotten introduced to economics at some point. But where does this come from in your own life?
Well, I was lucky enough, in fact, to be an economics student at Keynes, where I was fully given a long indoctrination almost in Keynes thinking. But later, in the late 90s, I was running a small charitable company which was publishing psychoanalytic journals onto a CD-ROM. And one day my office door opened, and through the door came two very experienced venture capitalists from one of London's biggest and most important venture capitalist companies. And they wanted to buy this CD-ROM company and turn it into an internet.com, etc. Well, we looked at it, and they were going to offer us money and everything else. Now, in fact, the company was a joint venture between an American and British professional organization, and it would have been very complicated to sell it. But the experience was very interesting as to how people who knew nothing about the internet, nothing about psychoanalysis, and not much about publishing were willing to spend. They were offering $2 to $3 million for this. Of course, we said no, but it's fascinating. And then, of course, a few months later, the whole market in dot-coms completely evaporated. So this is what led me to think I've got to bring together my economics, my sociology, and my psychoanalysis, because I thought I could see something, which is that from a psychoanalyst point of view, all the asset price bubbles like the South Sea onwards are, in fact, an emotional trajectory. That's what they are. They're actually a path-dependent emotional trajectory. So this is how I began to describe them.
So you got into this. It was this dot-com bubble that where all the pieces started to fit together, and you started to work on this. So this was in your mind already before the financial crisis, and it sounds to me like that kicked you into high gear.
Well, it was even more lucky than that it took me a bit of time to get some funding from the Leverhulme Trust to do interviews of fund managers, which I wanted to see how could the normal market lead to this kind of phenomena of the dot-com.
So you were doing this before the crisis?
So I ended up interviewing these people by luck, 2007. The first in January, the last in August, when the credit crunch had already begun. So this is a very experienced group of fund managers who I could understand or could talk to them about what was going on then. And the great thing about the INET grant that I've got is that I've, in fact, doing it now, I've started going back and seeing them 4 years later to see whether they're doing things differently, they understand things differently, and what's happened to them, to try and build the theory more.
Now, this interview strategy is a very new one for economics. I see you were influenced maybe by Truman Bewley's interviews of managers about wages. He's a mathematical economist, okay, who got frustrated not being able to understand and using the normal tools, and went out and asked managers. So is that right, that you were influenced by?
It's not actually true. I went and did this study, but then I was lucky enough to have an afternoon talking to George Akerlof 18 months ago in Berkeley, and he told me about the Bewley study, which I do think is a superb piece of work, and gave me the confidence also to do this. And indeed, one of the things I'm trying to argue is that economists should use interviews as a data source. And the traditional argument against interviews, as you know, is that, well, people can't really tell you how they make decisions because they don't know. Well, that isn't necessary to either the way Bewley did it or what I did, because we're not claiming that we know how these people made their minds up, we can psychoanalyze them, anything like that. What we're claiming, however, is that the conditions facing them when they make decisions have certain characteristics which limit the kind of decisions, and in particular limit the extent to which you can be rational in the very limited sense that economists use that word.
Well, this is just fascinating, and we look very much forward to seeing the results of your research. At INET, new economic thinking means new thinking about the economy, not necessarily by economists, but if you'll have us, we'll include you in our stable of INET economists.
I'm very, very pleased about that.
Welcome.